Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the world's fate rests in Africa's hands. US President Joe Biden sets out the growing role that the continent plays in the global economy as he makes a swan-song visit and showcases billions in US infrastructure investments in Africa. Also, in Ghana, electoral promises to pull the country out of its serious economic crisis are likely to tip the balance in this weekend's presidential vote. We hear the concerns of some of the voters prepping to have their say. And in South Africa, safe houses are a lifeline for victims of domestic abuse. They offer a place for victims to hide, plan, recover from their abusers in a country where attacks on women is the most widespread human rights abuse. But in Cape Town, refugees are struggling to stay afloat. But first, in Angola, on the first ever visit by a US president on Tuesday, Joe Biden said that the US is all in on Africa and highlighted the global stakes resting on the continent's realization of its goals. Now, Biden's counterpart and host, Joao Lourenco, was equally effusive about the value of the trip.
This not only buries a past part of our relationship, during which, in the context of the Cold War, we weren't always aligned, but also marks an important turning point in our relationship, which will undoubtedly gain a new dynamic from today onwards.
You've heard me say it before, but the United States is all in Angola. We've already, my administration alone, has invested over $3 billion in Angola thus far. The future of the world is here in Africa and in Angola.
Well, as you heard there, Biden is showcasing the $3 billion US commitment to the creation of the Lobito Corridor. Now, he'll be later visiting Zambia and DR Congo on his tour, all of them countries to be connected by this railway that's meant to counter Chinese influence in the region. Now, for more on the context within which all this sits, I'm joined now from South Africa by Dr. Ongama Mtinka, the acting director of the Raymond Mhlaba Center for Governance and Leadership. Doctor, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to me. Now, first of all, we had a lot of big feelings, big plans on show there. What's your take on what Biden's trip says about the changing nature of Africa's relations with the rest of the world? And is this mutual respect and declarative collaboration sustainable?
It shows the importance of Africa in the geopolitical and geostrategic interests between the West and the US and China. On the other hand, the EU and the US have been catching up as far as infrastructure investment in that region, given the centrality of Zambia, Angola, the DRC, in the new scramble for Africa when it comes to some of the minerals that are necessary for the energy transitions that are taking place, whether it be battery storage or minerals that are key in technological advancement. China had prioritized that area since the 1970s, building a railway line from Zambia to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And the US was lagging behind along with the European Union. And I think in the last, say, 8 years, we've seen a concerted effort to regain momentum in terms of mega project financing in that region.
Do you reckon, though, that, bearing in mind some of the geopolitical shifts that are likely to shake up the US's foreign policy once Donald Trump takes over from Biden in January, do you reckon that some of the statements and sentiments expressed by Biden on this current trip are sustainable? And what do you think is likely to change once the administration changes in the US?
So interestingly, the interests of big tech in the US are, in fact, influenced by the demand. They trigger the demand for some of the minerals that are concerned here. So there will likely be some continuity. However, the tit for tat and coercive diplomatic approach that Trump seems to be suggesting might jeopardize some of these, but I don't think. I think eventually cool heads will prevail, but I think that it's not going to be easy. Also, I mean, with Biden coming so late in his term, having not set foot here, say for attending a conference in Egypt, it does say that this is a very late attempt, but it has always been led by U.S. financing interests mainly, because even though there hasn't been state presence, they have had an interest in mega project financing there. I expect that that's going to continue. However, there are concerns that are there among African leaders about, for example, the continuity of policy programs like the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. Trump seems to be very emphatic that U.S. foreign policy interests have to be tied in with its trade interests. And this is something that, doesn't bode, that's not going to make easy and seamless the transition from this administration to the Trump administration.
Thank you so much for that breakdown, Dr. Ongama Mtinka, there on Joe Biden's trip to Africa, where he was in Angola on Tuesday, declaring that the US is all in on the continent. Now to Namibia, where the results are in, and it looks like the country has elected its first female president. Vice President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah has been declared the winner of last week's polls with 57% of the vote. That means her SWAPO party retains its 34-year sway. It's also bagged the majority in the parliamentary elections. Last Wednesday's voting had to be extended until Saturday because of technical problems, and opposition parties do say that they will mount a court challenge to the results. Meanwhile, voters in Ghana are poised for their own polls. The country's painful cost of living crisis is top of mind for many who are gearing up for Saturday's election. Our Lauren Berstecker tells us more.
In this open-air market in the Ghanaian capital, locals hurriedly brush past an array of colorful stalls, selling everything from cell phones to food and clothes. But these days, very few customers actually stop to make a purchase, much to the despair of this local vendor.
Anybody who comes here is, I don't have money and I cannot buy, and this is too expensive.
An increasingly common situation as Ghana continues to grapple with one of the worst economic crises in its history. In 2022, inflation reached a peak of 54%, while national public debt rose to over 90% of GDP. Faced with skyrocketing prices and a rapid currency depreciation, the government last year agreed to a $3 billion IMF bailout. And while the first semester of 2024 saw a slight economic upturn, many Ghanaians continue to struggle to make ends meet. A cost of living crisis that's now shaping up to be a decisive issue in the upcoming presidential elections.
There is thousands of graduates that are free from education, but there is no job. They are just doing petty jobs. And those petty jobs, they cannot sustain them.
The present government has done a good job. So what I want is that I need continuation.
Opposition leader and presidential candidate John Mahama has vowed to renegotiate the terms of the IMF bailout if he's elected this weekend. Meanwhile, his main rival and ruling party candidate Mahamadou Bawumia is asking voters for more time in order to stabilize Ghana's struggling economy.
Now, South African campaigners are in the midst of ramping up for an awareness drive about the scale and impact of violence against women in the country. It has a domestic violence rate 5 times higher than the global average, and it is the most common rights abuse there. Victims sometimes need to hide from their abusers, but despite appeals for financial help, half of Cape Town's safe houses are on the verge of closing down. Our team sent us this report.
Some of the victims living here don't know where they are. The risk that their abusive partner will search for them is too high.
So she's baking for tomorrow. The house mother, we have 4 of them, and they rotate. Over here we have bedroom number 2. We can fit a lot of people in here. When the clients get here, they've got nothing but the clothes on their back. And when they come in, we give them about 5 or 6 sets of clothes.
The government subsidises 40% of the budget. The rest depends on donations, but raising funds is becoming increasingly difficult.
There's a few shelters that if they don't get a substantial amount of money in the next 3 months, there is the possibility of closing down, and we're one of them.
For the 15 women living in this safe house, the prospect of it closing down is terrifying. Keisha's 21 years old and has been hiding here for 3 months.
My mom was raped by our neighbor, and when we decided for the first time to open up and speak about our issue, we appeared in court. We were threatened they will kill us because that is the rule in our area. So I feel safe here, yes, and I feel like I could be here forever.
Cape Town is home to around 20 shelters, but half of them are under threat of shutting down. The president of the association organising them says they need to increase capacity rather than close.
About assault, there was 14,000 cases reported from July to September, and there was almost 1,000 women murdered in that period. So we're looking at 15,000 beds should be available, and we have 300.
Domestic violence is on the rise in South Africa. The rate of femicide is 5 times higher than the average for the rest of the world.
Well, Kenyan wildlife conservationists are racing against time to try and save the country's cheetahs from extinction. It's a threat that is catching up with the species. Its populations plummeted to less than 7,000 globally. Kenya's rolled out a national plan, but numbers just keep on shrinking.
In Kenya, we have only around 20% of the land mass that has been set aside for wildlife conservation. And this land has kept on shrinking because of encroachment, and by so doing, they end up losing their habitats. The numbers keep on dwindling.
We should be avoiding situations where we have to do reintroductions. Do it well in the first place. Don't do the mistake in the first place. Don't cause numbers to go so low that you get into this expensive and complex process. But reintroduction and restoration of habitats and of cheetah and other animals has a place in conservation.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, though. Do so again if you can. Take care.